Thank you, everyone, for your interest in the WAIS-5 and for joining us today. I know it's afternoon for some of you, morning for others. We appreciate your taking the time out of your day to join us and learn more about this new test. I just want to mention that I have worked for Pearson for quite a few years, but prior to joining Pearson, I had a private practice for about 10 years where I did nothing but assessment. And the WAIS, along with the WISC and the WIPSI, were very much cornerstones of my practice. So it's nice to get back to talking about using the WAIS in private practice. And it explains why I chose the title Time, Money, and Clinical Accuracy, because obviously those of us in clinical practice, we want to make sure we're using tests that are giving us reliable, valid, accurate information about our clients' abilities. But we're also business people, and we're concerned about, well, time is money. And so those things are on our mind as well, kind of a dual hats that we wear. So I wanted to talk some about how the WAIS meets our needs to save time, save money, and make a living out of what we love doing. Here's our agenda for today. The first half or so, I will apologize if those of you who were on our previous half-hour webinars, you saw some of this information in the past. We're going to talk about what's new with the WAIS-5. We're going to focus on testing time and the new test structure. We're going to take quite a bit of time to look at the new ancillary index scales and special group studies and a few other things. But then we're going to move on to new material, which, as I said, is talking about using the WAIS-5 in private practice. And we'll look at its application to specific referral questions, ones that I frequently encountered, and I'm guessing is the same for you. And finally, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So what's new? Here's the areas we're going to go over. We're going to talk a little bit about the updated norms. We're going to talk about reduced administration time, which I think will be a hit with most folks. We'll review the new test structure and the new subtests, as well as the new ancillary index scales, and boy, are there a lot of them. We'll take a look at special group studies, and we'll talk briefly about the expanded clinical utility of this new version of the test, as well as the improved user experience we've built in, and we hope you appreciate. So let's talk first about updated norms. You know about the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect tells us that about every 10 years, we see approximately a 3-point increase in full-scale IQ. So what that means is that cognitive ability tests age, just like we do, but not in a good way. So the WAIS-4 was published in 2008. You do the math of how many points increase we might expect in full scale over that time. But the WAIS-4, of course, can't keep pace with that because it was normed back in probably around 2007. So those older tests like the WAIS-4 are going to likely overestimate some of our clients' scores now. So moving to the WAIS-5, the normative sample was collected in 2023 and 2024. So it reflects the most recent societal shifts and trends. It matches the most recent census on 5 key demographic variables. So you can be sure that you're comparing your client's performance with that of folks now. And I'm going to add to you that it's also, these are folks after COVID. We actually had about half the data for the WAIS-5 collected prior to COVID hitting. And we had a lot of hard decisions to make, whether we moved forward when we were able to. We had to discontinue norming the test, excuse me, standardization. And we had to ask ourselves, should we go ahead and continue and just get the second half of the normative sample collected after COVID relented some, or should we start over? Well, we made the decision to start over, which is why WAIS-5 is now extremely current, and you can feel confident in comparing your clients' performance to what you see in the norms. Administration time, here's something I hope you'll be quite happy about. If you just need to obtain a full-scale IQ, it's going to take you 45 minutes or so. That was the median time in our normative sample. Now, the full-scale IQ is calculated from 7 subtests, but in order to obtain it, you actually must administer one additional subtest, and that is you have to administer digits forward prior to digit sequencing. But the good news is that takes only 1 minute. Okay, you just need to remember to do it. The reason for that is that's the way it was done when we were norming the test. And we want to make sure you're doing a standard administration with everything done in exactly the same way. If you need all 5 of the primary index scales, it's going to take you 60 minutes. Again, the primary index scales are calculated using 10 subtests, but you'll need to give one more, an 11th subtest in addition, that 1 minute to give digits forward prior to digit sequencing. Now, you may be saying, what? Did she say 5 index scales? I've been given the WAIS-4 forever, and there are only 4 primary scales on there. What's going on? Well, that brings us into the new test structure. Here's the full-scale IQ, and you'll see the 5 primary index scales. Verbal comprehension you're used to, but visuospatial and fluid reasoning are new. Back on the WAIS-4, we had a perceptual reasoning scale, and that has been broken in half. When we do a factor analysis, we see that these are actually 2 different sets of abilities, and so we have separated them out. For those of you who give the WISC, you're already used to this, but for those of you for whom it's new, I'm going to say more in a moment to help you understand the difference between the 2. What you'll see to get a full-scale IQ, you'll be giving 2 verbal comprehension subtests, 1 visuospatial task, block design, 2 fluid reasoning tasks, 1 working memory, and 1 processing speed test. Important that you look down at the bottom and see that only 1 substitution is permitted when you're deriving the full-scale IQ. And that's because if you change out more than 1, the components of your full scale are going to differ too much from that with which we norm the test. And that difference means we've introduced more error than we'd like. So remember, only 1 substitution of 1 subtest when you're gathering the full-scale IQ. Moving on to the primary index scales, they're the same 5 we just looked at, with perceptual reasoning now being broken out into visuospatial and fluid reasoning. And to get the primary index scales, you'll see we have 2 subtests that contribute to each of them. Now here, subtest substitution is not permitted for any of the primary index scores. And I think you can guess why, because there each is only made up of 2 subtests. If you substitute for 1, you've got a 50% difference in content from what we use to norm the test. So we're going to tell you no substitutions for primary index scores, but remember you can make 1 substitution and still get that full-scale IQ. Let's talk a little bit more now about these 2 new index scales, visual spatial and fluid reasoning. And these nice little cartoon characters help us understand this. If you think about the skills needed to do well on the visual spatial index, they're similar to those that an architect needs. That is, the ability to take visual information and use it to build a geometric design that matches a model. So you're going to get visual information and you're going to see a visual model of where you're headed, what you're supposed to do with it. So block design and visual puzzles, if you think of them, work exactly that way. On the other hand, fluid reasoning, those are skills more like those that a detective needs. They need to be able to use visual information to identify a common theme or concept or rule, and then apply that rule to new visual information to figure out how to reason with it how to solve a problem and get the correct answer. So the two subtests that contribute to that are matrix reasoning and figure weights. And while you have multiple response options, okay, we don't tell you what the final should look like. You're having to figure out which one is correct. Here's a busy slide, and we're going to spend several minutes on this because this is really important. This is a big part of what's new and what I think is going to be extremely helpful in private practice. And these are our ancillary index scales. If you look across the slide, you'll see this is the VCI, this is the new visual spatial scale, the fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And then we'll move on to the last category. Under VCI, you have an expanded crystallized scale, which has 4 subtests. You're going to be able to look in great detail at strengths and weaknesses and how folks do on an expanded VCI task. There's also a verbal reasoning task where we just use reasoning tasks. And one of the new ones here is set relations, which we'll review in just a moment. We also have an expanded visuospatial scale, and that too has 4 subtests contributing to it. There's also an expanded fluid reasoning ancillary scale. And again, you're going to see 4 subtests in there, including a new one. There's a quantitative reasoning scale, one that's important if you want to see how folks do in using numerical and quantitative information. When we move over to working memory, you'll see we have a great deal of ancillary scales. First, we have an expanded working memory scale, which contains both visual and auditory tasks. Then we have solely visual working memory made up of symbol span and spatial addition, and we'll talk about those new subtests. And then we have 2 auditory working memory subtests. One just looks at the ability to register information, to hold it online, okay? One of those is new, that's running digits. We'll go over what that is. And then finally, we have auditory working memory, which is the manipulation portion of working memory. And here you'll see digit sequencing, digits backward, and letter number sequencing. Finally, we go over to processing speed. There's an expanded processing speed scale. And then there's one with reduced motor processing. So for folks with motor difficulties, you can administer just symbol search and naming speed quantity, another new test that I'll tell you about. And finally, we have a completely non-motor scale. And here you'll see subtests that contribute to the VCI, to visual spatial, to fluid reasoning, to working memory, and to processing speed. But the processing speed task does not require any response booklets. And you'll see that block design is gone, so you don't need any motor responses. I'm going to talk more about this in just a moment. Over on the right, you'd be expecting to see a GAI, or General Ability Index, what I think of as kind of the horsepower. This is reasoning and problem solving, the heavy lifting that our brains have to do in order to do well on cognitive ability tests. Its co-partner here is cognitive proficiency. This is made up of working memory and processing speed subtests. These are going to show how quickly and how efficiently you can apply those to do these heavy lifting tasks. Finally, we have a nonverbal scale, okay? And this minimizes the amount of verbal responses and language that's needed. So this is good for clients with language difficulties, perhaps some language dysfunction, perhaps English was not their first language, but they're fluent in it now, but you're still concerned about a language causing excuse me, an artificial lowering of their test scores. So you'd want to give the nonverbal. All right, here's the important part. This non-motor scale can also be used for remote administration. Remember, no need for blocks, No need for response booklets. It's all non-motor, so it really lends itself to being given remotely over the computer. All right, you're going to have to say goodbye to a couple of subtests. I told you about some of the new ones that are coming on board, and we're going to see them in more detail. But to make room for those, we removed picture completion and cancellation. Picture completion, it turns out that the construct it was measuring was not as representative of visual spatial ability as the other tests we had. So we maintained the other subtests and let this one go. We also wanted to decrease our emphasis on speed. And frankly, we found it was probably the least frequently used of the subtests on WAIS-4. So we hope you won't miss it too much, but keep your WAIS-4 kit around. If you feel it's important for a particular client, you can always give it from WAIS-4. Cancellation is also gone. A couple of reasons for that. One is it has a very low G loading and correlates quite low with the other processing speed tasks. It's also not very clinically sensitive in adults. If you're trying to measure visual neglect, there are other neuropsychological measures available that can do a better job of that in the adult population. And finally, we wanted to make room for a motor-free processing speed measure, okay, which is naming speed quantity, which we're now going to look at in a moment. We're going to say hello to these new subtests, which I've given you a little preview of up above. And for each one here, I've shown you which index it contributes to: set relations, fluid reasoning, running digits, working memory, naming speed quantity, processing speed, but non-motor. Symbol span and spatial addition are now part of the WAIS, and they contribute only to some of our ancillary index scales. So let's look first at set relations. Here the examinee reviews relationships among concepts. The concepts are depicted as circles, and they select the response option that best depicts the relationship between the concepts that's been described in words. So here are the options, okay? And I'm going to say to my client, which one best shows how gray things and rocks go together? So my first option here is there's no overlap. No gray things are rocks, no rocks are gray things. Second, over here, this shows me rocks are completely subsumed within gray things. So all rocks are gray things. That doesn't sound quite right. And here the other way around, all gray things are subsumed under the category of rocks. That doesn't sound right either. Here we see there's some overlap. Some gray things are rocks, some rocks are gray things. And that, of course, is the correct answer. So this is how set relations is going to work and contribute to fluid reasoning. Next is running digits, which is new to the working memory index. Here the examinee is read a sequence of digits and has to recall a specified number of digits at the end in order. Now we designed it so that they can't use rehearsal or continually update the last digits in working memory because they don't know how many digits at the end they're going to be asked for, 2, 3, 4. So this is giving us a better coverage of working memory structure. And here's a tip for you. This has a faster administration rate than the other digit subtests. You're going to be reading 2 digits per second. And because this is quite a change for after many years of getting used to reading 1 per second, we recommend you download a metronome app and make sure you silence it. And that can be helpful in keeping you on the right pace. If you're using Q Interactive to administer WAIS-5, there'll be a metronome included, the pacing will be included, and so you'll be able to read at exactly the correct rate. Now, here's how it works. I say, I'm going to say some numbers. When I stop, tell me the last, in this case, 3 numbers in the order I say them. Then I'll say 2, 9, 4, 8, 9, 5, 4, 9, 3. And the correct response is the last three digits, 493. But my client doesn't know when they're coming because there may be more digits that are read after that. So this is kind of a tough subtest, and I think one that will be helpful to you in picking apart when someone is having difficulty with working memory. Moving along to the processing speed index, we have the naming speed quantity subtest, and here the client has 75 seconds to name the number of squares inside a series of boxes as quickly as possible. Now, for those of you who give the WISC and who moved on to some of those tests in the third STEM book, this was on there, so you may have seen it before. And you'll know what this tip is telling you: be prepared for very fast item completion. Administration times for the entire subtest are frequently under 1 minute. So you're going to have to very quickly be noting any errors that are made. Here's what it looks like for the client. I say to them, name how many squares are in each box as fast as you can without making mistakes. So they've got to say 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 4. So you can see how quickly that's going to move. Next, we have symbol span, and this contributes, as I said, to the ancillary index scales. Here, the examinee is going to view one or more abstract symbols, and we've tried to make ones that aren't easily captured with verbal constructs. Then they're going to have to select them in sequential order when they see a set of response options. You're going to have the option of awarding 2 points or 1 point for their response, depending on what you get. In order to get 2 points, they have to recall all of the correct symbols they saw and only the correct symbols, and they must give them to you in the correct order. If they recall all the correct symbols and only the correct symbols, but give them in an incorrect order, then you'll award 1 point. So here's an example. Here's a stimulus that they see. And I say, look carefully at the symbols and remember the order that you see them. Then that goes away. They see the response options. And I say, point to the symbols I just showed you in the order you saw them. The 2-point response would be D, B, because those would be in the correct order. The 1-point response would be B, and then D, the order in which they point to them, because they got them all right. They didn't get any false ones, and they did them, but they did not do them in the correct order. Spatial addition is next. This too contributes to ancillary index scales. Here the examinee is shown 2 grids in sequence, each of which contains blue and red circles. After each pair of grids is shown, the examinee uses a set of chips to create a new grid of their own. What they have to do is combine the 2 grids they saw based on a set of rules. And I'm going to show you an example of how this works. Remember this as being the only WAIS-5 subtest with start points based on the age of the examinee. So for your older examinees, you're going to use an earlier, easier start point for them. Here's what you're going to be handing to your clients: red, white, and blue chips. Then you're going to show them this and say, this is the first one. So it's the first grid. This is the second one. And then you'll say to them, now put the circles in the grid. So you're going to give them a grid to work on. And notice here, where there was only one of the 2 grids had a blue chip, the rule says if you saw just one blue chip, put a blue chip in there yourself. But look up in the top right-hand corner and you'll see they've put a white chip. And that's because both of the grids they saw had a blue chip in that position. And the rule they've been taught is where there are 2 blue chips, you're going to substitute with a white chip. So there's quite a bit of mental processing going on here, a lot to remember, rules to remember, visual information to remember. So I think this is a great test and a great addition to the WAIS. Let's talk just for a moment about special group studies. Here are the ones we have right now. Intellectually gifted, I believe to fall into this group for standardization, you needed an IQ of 130 or above. Intellectual disability, mild and moderate. We have specific learning disorders in both reading and math, ADHD, ASD, traumatic brain injury, TBI, moderate or severe, mild cognitive impairment or MCI, and then probable dementia of the Alzheimer's type of a mild severity. Now, before I move on and talk about looking at those in your practice, I want to just mention a couple more things about the test. One is expanded clinical utility. You've seen we have broader construct coverage now for working memory, fluid reasoning, and processing speed. We have those expanded index scores all across the board to help you increase your interpretive clarity. And we have new index scales that help us reduce the confound of expressive language or motor problems, and also make this an ideal test for remote testing. And those are the nonverbal index, the non-motor index, which remember helps us with remote testing as well, and motor reduced processing speed index. Finally, we've tried to improve your user experience in using this test. We have simplified administration and scoring directions. That should be a help both for you and for your clients. And there are multiple options for administration, scoring, and reporting. Of course, there are traditional paper and pencil kits. You can score them by hand, or you can score them using Q Global. And I will mention that we are giving you a free year of Q Global scoring, a Q Global scoring subscription for 1 year if you choose that kit, okay? So might as well try it if you've been scoring by hand. And I scored by hand for a long time in my practice because I found I could do it kind of under the table while my folks were working on things like the Wyatt. They were doing math problems, things like that. I could get scoring done. But Q Global makes life so easy and gives you a wonderful report. The other way you can administer the WAIS-5 is using Q Interactive. This is our system that utilizes 2 iPads, requires no record forms, and includes scoring and reporting. And the scoring and reporting is identical to that that's done for the paper and pencil test, because behind the scenes, Q Interactive is calling on Q Global to do the scoring and to produce the identical report. All right, let's move on and talk about private practice and applying the WAIS-5 to specific referral questions. These are the ones that I pulled out. You'll see they largely match what we looked at in terms of special group studies. So if you want more information on what these groups of folks looked like in our special group studies, you can always refer to the technical manual and take a look at that. But we're not saying that you should expect a client with ADHD to look like what we saw. It's simply going to give you an idea of what you may see, things to be on the lookout for. So we have ADHD, ASD, concussion and TBI, dementia and mild cognitive impairment, doing disability evaluations, testing for giftedness, intellectual disability, SLD, and then I'm going to say a word or two about remote testing. Let's look first at ADHD. Now, technically, you don't need to get an IQ score or give a cognitive ability test, but it adds a great deal to a comprehensive evaluation of ADHD, and I always used it. And I think there are a number of reasons why it's important to do so. One, obviously, we're not using it alone. There is no test that tells us whether someone has ADHD. It's a clinical diagnosis. So we want to make sure we take a detailed history and use targeted questionnaires and probably a good record review. I found it really, really helpful to request school records and was surprised to find how easy it was in most cases to get them, even for folks who've been out of school for a long time. Also, a cognitive ability test is generally going to be required If your client is asking for accommodations in an academic or a workplace situation, so you want to check on that and be sure that you're giving everything they're going to need to get what they're after. It provides useful information for generating interventions to make life easier for them and to help in their planning, counseling. And finally, it gives clues as to possible comorbid learning disabilities. And I like to think of ADHD as a social disorder in that it doesn't like to appear on its own. Almost everyone with ADHD also has at least one other comorbid disorder. And one of the most common is a learning disability. So we want to make sure we don't miss that. So a cognitive ability test and quite likely an academic achievement test as well is going to help you a lot. The other thing about the WAIS-5 is that the new subtests and new scales allow you to do a deeper dive into aspects of working memory dysfunction, which, as we know, is a component of ADHD and sometimes one of the most difficult ones getting in the way. So the more we can learn about what part of working memory may be not functioning up to par, the better job we can do of designing interventions and accommodations. And as I mentioned, you can look in the manual and see what our ADHD special group looked like. Autism spectrum disorder. You may be finding, many of my customers are, that this is an increasingly popular diagnostic referral when adults are coming to you. They have seen symptoms described on social media. It's piqued their interest. They think, I wonder what this is, what I've been struggling with all my life. And they may want a formal diagnosis so they can do better self-advocacy, or they can ask for accommodations. Again, cognitive ability testing is going to add a great deal to a comprehensive evaluation for ASD. It provides clues about information processing that are extremely helpful in knowing what to recommend. Again, generally required if they're going to be asking for accommodations in the workplace or in school, and provides, again, useful information for generating interventions and planning what to deal with in counseling. Obviously, it's not the only thing you want to be giving. You want to be augmenting this with adaptive behavior measures, something like the Vineland-3. I would recommend a broadband measure of psychopathology, something like the MMPI-3, and behavioral observations are going to be your best friend when trying to accurately diagnose particularly high-functioning folks on the autism spectrum. Concussion and TBI. Now, WAIS-5 is very much at the heart of an evaluation for these disorders. It's going to help you determine the areas of dysfunction versus what functions have been preserved. It's going to help you plan interventions so you can make good recommendations to whoever is going to be working with this person. It helps you monitor recovery from their injury and helps you determine the appropriate timing for them to return to work, return to school, and also return to athletic play. That's a big issue these days as we learn more and more about the effects of concussion or TBI, and in particular, repeated injuries from those who play soccer, play football, and other contact sports. Moving on to dementia and MCI. WAIS-5, again, a critical component of diagnosis. I would say, along with tests of memory and language, sometimes other tests are going to be helpful as well, but that's the big three triad I think of. It's going to help you differentiate between normal cognitive aging or mild impairment and true dementia of the Alzheimer's type or frontotemporal dementia. It's going to help you determine the ability of your client to manage finances and other affairs. And again, to do this, I wouldn't rely solely on a cognitive ability test, but I'd augment it with a measure or two of adaptive behavior, something like the independent living scales, the Texas functional living scales. We also have a fairly new measure called the Everyday Memory Survey, which is extremely helpful, can be completed by the client and or by someone close to them who sees a good a bit of their behavior and can indicate where they're having difficulty. And of course, the Vineland-3 is always there. And finally, sadly, for many of these folks, we're going to need to track degeneration over time because we need to determine when it's appropriate for a change of living situation, more interventions. Perhaps they need to be thinking about guardianship for a relative. And so this is going to help us monitor when it's time to change what we're doing. Disability evaluations. Again, cognitive ability testing is key to most of these evaluations. I want to mention this here, and you'll see me mention it again on the next few slides. And that is because we're moving from WAIS-4 to WAIS-5, you want to check your state's requirements for disability determination. Okay, what specific tests, subtests, or scales do they require you to administer and report to them? What are the cut points for qualification? And the point being, I've been looking at what disability determination from various states sends out as their requirements to evaluators. And then right now, they talk about WAIS-4 and which subtests, which scales need to be reported. But remember, we have a new test structure, we have new subtests, so these may need updating, and you'll need to work with your state's disability determination office to make sure that they get things updated and moving into what we have to present and provide to them in WAIS-5. Intellectual disability, these are a lot of the disability determinations, although not all, that we do. Again, cognitive ability testing is key to diagnosis, along with a measure or measures of adaptive behavior, like the Vineland-3. It's not unusual for clients with intellectual disabilities to score better on measures of processing speed and sometimes some aspects like registration of working memory. That is, tests that contribute to the cognitive proficiency index rather than those measures of horsepower, reasoning, and problem solving that are reflected in the GAI. But if you look again in the manual, you'll see we actually expect all test scores to be lower than they are in the general population. Once again, I'll urge you to check your state requirements for what needs to be administered and reported, and also what the cut points are for qualification. And you may need to work with them to get things updated for WAIS-5. We'll be doing that work on our end as well to help them get up to speed. Giftedness. Here's a nice new feature that I think you're going to appreciate. WAIS-5 facilitates the administration and reduces the testing time by providing specific start points for folks where you suspect giftedness. And these start points reduce the time to obtain all 5 primary index scales from 60 to 50 minutes. So right there in your median test time, you're going to gain 10 minutes rather than going on and on and on. Once again, I'm going to suggest you check the requirements of the referral source. For example, is your client coming in because they want to join Mensa? And so you want to make sure you're giving the required measures and know what the cut points are for qualification. Specific learning disabilities. Well, the AAD, the Ability Achievement Discrepancy Method of Identification, we know that's largely been replaced by others, at least in school districts and LEAs, but I feel like it can still provide important information. And this is, again, is based on my 10 years or so of doing these types of evaluations in my practice. I recommend pairing the WAIS-5 with an age-appropriate academic measure, for example, the Wyatt-4, which would take you up to age 50, and look for patterns of strengths and weaknesses, as well as an overall comparison between problem-solving, reasoning, cognitive ability, and actual performance in academic areas. Once again, check ahead of time to make sure you're giving the right measures and the right scales to qualify for accommodations. In this case, you'll probably be checking with a university their disability office, working with students who have learning disabilities, or the testing organization if they're looking for extended time or other accommodations on something like a GMAT, an LSAT, or something from the College Board. Let's say a word about remote testing. And the first thing to do is to determine whether you're going to have a facilitator at your remote location. I have a lot of customers who do remote testing for schools, and they actually have a facilitator with their client at the other end at the school location. It might be a teacher, maybe even a special ed teacher. It might be a teaching assistant. But if you have that, it's appropriate, if you like, to meet with them ahead of time, make sure they're comfortable with on their end, doing what needs to be done with the blocks to give block design, and using the response booklets to give coding and symbol search. Okay. However, if you don't have that luxury, or you're not comfortable with it, or it doesn't make sense, they are truly remote and you're not going to drive that distance to have this conversation and train the person correctly as a facilitator, that's when you're going to consider using that non-motor ancillary index scale. What you see is it has two subtests that give you a verbal comprehension index. It gives you visual puzzles for visual spatial. It gives you matrix reasoning and figure weights for fluid reasoning. Digit sequencing is the measure of working memory, and naming speed quantity is that non-motor measure of processing speed. Gives you a very good indicator of processing speed. In summary, the WAIS-5, I think, is pretty well suited for private practitioners. It's a broadband measure that's based on our contemporary understanding of cognitive ability. It has expanded scales and narrowband options, so you can better understand components of that cognitive ability. It gives you an easier way to do remote testing, and it also reduces testing time and provides simplified administration for you and for your clients. So what's next? Well, in case you're not aware, in case we haven't sent you enough emails, the next step I recommend is per seat training. This is a new option that we designed especially for private practitioners. It's a 3-hour webinar that includes hands-on practice with administration and scoring, provides you with 3 CEs if you're a psychologist. It's priced, we hope, affordably for you. Those 3 hours are $95. Or if you apply as a group of 3 or more when you register, the price goes down to $80.75. There's a long URL there to go where you can find details and how to register. But all you have to do is go to our website, click up top, type in WAIS-5, go to the WAIS-5 page, and click on the training box. There are 5 boxes, things like kits, manuals, and this one says training options. And then you can read down the page and you'll see each individual 3-hour webinar per seat training option. And you'll see the day and time, and you can sign up for it. I recommend that you do it quickly because these are filling up as quickly as we're adding new ones. And I think it's just a great way to learn how to do this and feel really confident when you sit down to do it with your clients. All right, that's what I have prepared for us this afternoon. It's leaving us a little bit of time for questions. So I am going to ask my, there's
Hi,
Erin.
Gail. Yes,
Hi,
I'm
Erin.
here.
We have
Thank you.
questions?
That was so great. We do have some questions, and we'll put out a reminder to people if they have additional questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many live questions as we can during this part. So wanted to ask a couple of questions that we've seen. We did see a couple of questions about how long do professionals have to transition from using the WAIS-4 to the WAIS-5?
Great question. And I get asked that question a lot as well. So all of the ethical guidelines for psychologists, whether they come from NASP or whether they come from APA or from a state organization, tell us we should be using the most current version of a test, current revision. But I've yet to see one that says exactly when we have to make that switch. So that's the reason this question comes up so frequently. Typically, what's grown up is what's called a community consensus, that between 8 months and 1 year at the outside to move to the new test. We know not everyone is going to be able to do it right away. You may have lots of WAIS-4 materials, record forms left that you want to use up. That's fine. But you may want to go ahead and buy your kit now before the end of September, because we are still having our 10% pre-publication discount in effect through the end of September. So you have a year to get started with using it if you need to go that long, but you might as well buy it now and save a few bucks.
Great, thank you so much. Another question we had that came in a couple of times was, when is the WAIS-5 going to be available on Q Interactive?
Ooh, I have great news. That should be this week. The original date I saw was today. And if it's not today, it should be tomorrow. Am I right, Erin?
Yep, it's tomorrow, actually. Yep.
It's
The
tomorrow.
release will happen today, but it won't be available for customers until tomorrow. I did get a question also kind of along those.
Can I say one other thing about
Yeah.
that? Sure. So if you are using Q Interactive, WAIS-5 will show up. It will just show up as that you can add to your battery, but you are going to have to purchase a starter set. If you are the owner of the Q Interactive license, you should have received information about how to order those kits for everyone on your license. If you haven't seen that, contact your assessment consultant. What you'll get is the response booklets, which you still need for coding and symbol search, and you will also get scoring templates for those. And I believe the blocks are optional because most of us are just swimming in Wechsler blocks. But don't forget to order your starter kits. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. No, that's a good clarification. We saw some questions on that as well. We had another question too about if the WAIS-4 will be still available under Q Interactive. Yes, that we are not planning to take that away. We usually give customers, 2 to 4 years to transition to the new version, even though, as Gail mentioned, the recommended time to upgrade to the new version is a little bit longer, or quite a bit shorter than that. We give customers extra time to make that transition. We also got a question about, I think you had said something about, the pre-publication discount. So I'll just elaborate on that because we've gotten a few questions about that as well. Again, please go ahead and type additional questions into the Q&A box on Zoom. But with the discount for pre-publication pricing, that's offered right now on complete kits, and you can choose whether you get your complete kit in a box or in a soft-sided bag. You can also choose if you want to include a free 1-year subscription to Q Global. And so that 1-year subscription allows unlimited reporting for one user on Q Global for that year. So that's available right now. That pre-publication discount has been extended until September 30th, so we're encouraging people to take advantage of that pricing right now. All right, I'll go on to another question that we got. What are the recommendations for using the WAIS-5 versus the WISC when evaluating examinees that are 16 years old?
Oh, great question. Yes, another one I get frequently. If the client you're going to be testing, you suspect may be on the lower end of cognitive ability, you're probably going to want to lean toward the WISC. Whereas if you feel that they are of higher ability, you're probably going to lean toward the WAIS. The other thing, though, to keep in mind, though, is that the WAIS is shorter, okay? Takes less time. Our median times for administration were shorter. So if you have a client where you feel they may be easily tired out or not be able to deal with a longer number of, it's the same number of subtests, but less time to administer them on the WAIS. So that may also influence your decision.
Great, thank you so much. We had another question on, do the non-motor ancillary indexes, that non-motor ancillary index generate a full-scale IQ?
It does not generate a full-scale IQ. It generates an ancillary index score that can be used clinically in place of a full-scale IQ, because as I mentioned, it's going to cover all 5 of the primary index scale areas, although you won't be getting those index scales. So again, I would, if you're going to be using that, you want to check first with your referral source and make sure that they're going to be able to accept that and use that if they're trying to qualify someone for accommodations, for placement, whatever. So no, it's not going to produce a full scale. It's going to produce an ancillary scale score, just like a GAI or a CPI or a nonverbal.
Great. We've gotten a few questions about international adaptations of the WAIS-5, and I'll go ahead and take that question for you. We are working on some of our international adaptations of the WAIS-5. The timeline for those varies. If that's something that you're interested in and you're really anxious about that timeline, please reach out to an assessment representative or sales representative at Pearson, and they may be able to give you a little bit more information on that. There hasn't been any communications of anything really broadly. We're still working on that process. Typically, the international publications start happening about a year after the US version of the product releases for a lot of these. We like to make sure that we get this product released and then start working on the international adaptations once this one has been finalized. Gail, I did have a question about, can Q Interactive be used for remote administration? And if not, how do you do the remote administration when you're administering NMI?
Oh, great question. Okay. Technically, there is a way you could use Q Interactive to test remotely, but I think it's clunky. It's not the easiest way to do it. The way you would want to do it is to purchase digital materials for the WISC, and you would show them they're in PDF form, right? You would set up a video conference with your client at the other end. You would show the stimulus materials. So you have stimulus books in digital form. You'd show the stimulus materials. You'd have a record form at your end where you're writing down the responses. If you have Q Interactive, you could also be using Q Interactive to record the responses. But again, I think it works out a little more easily if you use the record form. And then you move forward and backward. You follow the same rules. You're reading the same instructions out of your examiner's manual. And that's basically it. If you're using the non-motor, you don't have to be worried about response booklets or blocks or any of that. Everything is easily given by showing them the stimulus materials, asking questions, and recording responses while you're on a Zoom call, much like this one. Anything you want to add to that, Erin?
We do actually have a telepractice guidance document, and so I'm going to try to put that out there in the chat, or maybe someone else on the call can put that in the chat before this call ends. That was recently just posted to our website. So if you go to pearsonclinical.assessment.com, you can go find the WAIS-5 page and you'll be able to see our telepractice guidance document. I highly recommend that for people that are thinking about using telepractice. There's a lot of great information there. Gail, yeah.
I was just going to say, we have great information on specific tests out there and giving them remotely. So there's general information on remote administration, and then also specific information for individual tests. So it really is extremely helpful in giving you the level of detail that you need to do it correctly. And it's something you want to practice several times before you go live with it.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions here. I'm going to answer one really quickly about if it was co-normed with the WIMS. Yes, the WAIS-5 is co-normed with WIMS-5. And so WIMS-5 will be available next year, right around this same time. But then, Gail, there was one really specific to private practice about, have you ever in the past billed for the cost of administration of an assessment separate from regularly coded services? Or, how would that be perceived in the industry and in private practice?
So I'm not sure. Can you clarify that a little bit for me, Erin? Are you saying a patient has insurance, but you're billing outside their insurance, or?
That's what it sounds like, billing outside their insurance for the administration of assessment.
Yeah, I hate to give advice about that because that's going to vary with every carrier with which for which you're a provider, and I hate to give any information that's not correct.
Great.
I know that, for example, things like oftentimes medical insurance or mental health insurance is not going to cover giving an academic subtest. They consider that to be outside the realm of mental health. So I know that many of my colleagues will bill for the WAIS-2 insurance and an MMPI and so forth, because those are all recognized as tests of cognitive and mental health skills and abilities or dysfunction, but the WIAT has to be billed separately and privately. But beyond that, I would check with your provider, the panel that you're on, to make sure you're not violating any of their rules.
Sure. And there may be state specific laws and rules around that sort of thing too, I'm sure. So that's great feedback and information. I just want to, take a moment to thank everybody for attending today, and thank you, Gail, for being here to share this information and answering questions. We were not able to answer all of the questions, but I think we got through quite a few. If we didn't get to your question, we will definitely make an effort to follow up with you and give you additional information. So stay tuned, and thank you for submitting your questions and for participating in the webinar. Thanks again, Gail, for sharing all this information. Anything else you'd like to say as we wrap up?
No, thank you. Just my pleasure. I know some of my customers are out there because I've heard from them. So a special hello to you folks in the Southeast that I deal with regularly, and welcome to everybody else. And we hope you enjoy the WAIS. We look forward to your feedback on it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Gail, and thank you everyone that attended today. We appreciate you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a great
Erin.
day. Bye-bye.
Bye.